really good work. In case you haven't noticed yet, we're a class act. At 8:30 tomorrow morning, the Walnut Room will be open for continuing registration. We'll have some coffee and pastry there for those of you who would like that, and the bookstore with sales of books from our participants and other books will still be open tomorrow all day, and we will have also the exhibit in the Walnut Room about the life and work of Chaim Perelman, if you haven't seen it yet. We know that some of you showed up kind of late and hurriedly and might be interested in that. I'm going to now introduce my colleague, David Frank, who is in the Robert D. Clark Honors College at the University of Oregon, and a Perelman scholar, as you, I'm sure, are aware. His book, called Shared Land, Conflicting Identity, about the rhetoric of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, is one of the most important works, in my view, to appear about that issue. And David will have some words to say about Noemi.
On behalf of my colleagues, John Gage, Jim Crosswhite, Suzanne Clark, and Lucie, I welcome those of you who have been welcomed thus far to Eugene and to the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the publication of the New Rhetoric. My understanding is that our gathering is the largest of the 4 celebrations scheduled this year, which include gatherings in Israel, Portugal, and Belgium. I thank the brilliant John Gage for the organizational genius he has demonstrated, and ask that you thank him not with applause, but by buying many copies of his book, Shape of Reason. You don't need to do this because it's one of the top textbooks adopted by scholars in composition across the country, but it would be a nice gesture otherwise. Because of John Gage, we have a terrific group of rhetoricians, including Jim Crosswhite, and I believe that Jim, and we certainly can debate this issue, is among the best readers of Perelman in the world. We are here because we have heard the voice of the new rhetoric, one that calls us to reason together with argument and rhetoric. Indeed, Jim Crosswhite captured the theme of our conference when 2 years ago he suggested that we use the title, The Promise of Reason. Now, in the wake of the 20th century, a century marred by genocide and world wars, and the face of the fundamentalism facing us today, our conference and Crossman's title may strike many as naive. Reason, it is held, typically yields to the hard power of violence. Yet the evidence of our presence here today suggests that over 130 scholars from Canada, Europe, South America, the Middle East, and Asia have been convinced and persuaded by the new rhetoric. 50 years after the publication of the new rhetoric, we can agree with Jim Crosswhite in his Rhetoric of Reason that the new rhetoric is, quote, the single most important event in contemporary rhetorical theory. And with Michael Leff, that the new rhetoric was an explosion in the humanities when it was published in 1958. The author of this event was Chaim Perelman, who in collaboration with Lucie Olbrechts-Tyteca advanced a radical claim, arguing that they were making a break with the concept of reason and reasoning advanced by the Enlightenment. Perelman's aspiration was to unveil an expression of reason that would navigate between the cold logic Hannah Arendt detected in totalitarianism and radical skepticism. Perelman sought to liberate reason from the constrictions of formal logic and to recover the role rhetoric played in the vita activa during the Renaissance, which, according to Dominique A. LaRusso, a professor at the University of Oregon, was marked by its concern for humanitas, that unique conception of passion and expression. We are here in part because we seek to unveil the sources and expressions of the new Rhetorics Humanitas. Richard Groff and Wendy Nguyen have explained that the new Rhetorics focus on communion suggests that it is possible and desirable for humans to acknowledge and craft what binds us together, and that we can disagree while remaining in relationship. To help us in our quest, we are honored by the presence of Chaim Perelman's daughter, Noemi, her husband, Daniel Mattis, and their grandson, Aaron. Daniel is a noted professor of physics at the University of Utah, and his research features submicron nanotechnology. As we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the new Rhetoric, I am delighted to share with you the news of another 50th anniversary. Daniel and Noemi will observe their 50th anniversary of their marriage this fall. You might buy a copy of John Gage's. And you are wondering, what can you buy for them to celebrate their anniversary? And my answer is John Gage's book. I am particularly delighted that Aaron, their grandson, who won a national championship or national recognition in international extemporaneous speaking, is here. And about a month ago, I had a chance to visit Noemi and Daniel, and they were so proud of the accomplishment of their grandson. They shared with me a DVD recording of Aaron's championship round. And I must say that chills are running up and down my spine because Aaron, in this championship round, gave an extemporaneous speech on the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Now, this was a document that his great-grandfather, Chaim Perelman, worked to justify with Richard McKeon, who was the dean at the University of Chicago back in 1948. I'm not sure if Aaron knew this, but his ability to marshal arguments in favor of universal rights suggested to me that there may be something that Aaron has inherited from his great-grandfather, his grandfather's grandmother. We have asked Noemi Perelman to speak this evening on the life of her father. In my conversations with Noemi over the last 14 years, she has repeatedly told me that she is not a scholar of rhetoric. She's not an expert of things rhetorical. Maybe. But she has taught me how to better understand her father's views on rhetoric. My colleagues in this audience, and if you ever have some compunctions or some worries about what the universal audience is, look around you. This is it. This is the universal audience. And I believe, as you will hear in a moment, that you can learn something from the biography and from the life of Chaim Perelman that will allow you to better understand how rhetoric works. Noemi holds a JD from the Free University of Brussels and a doctorate of psychology from Columbia. She is a well-known and a highly regarded psychologist. She shares her father's commitment to reason, but has devoted her professional life to an exploration of the darker sides of the human soul. Chaim Perelman, the philosopher, was passionately interested in the rational. His daughter has used reason to illuminate the irrational. Noemi has served as co-chair of the Utah Governor's Commission for Women and Families, and has been celebrated as a therapist who has brought relief, making use of reason to those who suffer. Noemi's keynote address tonight is titled, Chaim Perelman, A Life Well Lived. He lived a good life because, as a father, as a citizen, he detected and developed the connection between argumentation and moral action. Those who resisted Nazi tyranny, Jonathan Glover observes in his Humanity, A Moral History of the 20th Century, tended to come from homes in which children were encouraged to reason through argument. Children raised by parents who used corporal punishment or an authoritarian style of child-rearing were much less likely to rescue Jews or to engage in moral action. And tonight, you are, blessed to hear the voice of a Perelman, rehearsing for you the prophetic voice that you have read in the new Rhetoric. Noemi, thank you for joining us.
Hi, everybody. I'm Noemi. I'm the daughter of Chaim Perelman and of Fela Perelman. And I'm attending this conference as a historical artifact. Because indeed, I'm not a scholar of rhetoric. I'm not a historian of my father's life. My father had hoped that I would work with him in philosophy of law, so I studied law and some philosophy, but he would have been very surprised if I had stayed in Belgium. I fully intended to be an attorney, to enter the bar and to practice law and not at all go into academia. But life took a different turn. I married this guy here, to whom I've been married for 50 years. Happily most of the time. And I came to the United States and I wound up, after searching, looking for my way, I wound up being a psychologist. And this happens to be the one field of in the human endeavor, in the humanistic sciences, where my father's shadow does not extend. David asked me if it's rebellion. No, absolutely not. Without a doubt, I don't think anybody could ever rebel against my father, who was the kindest, most loving, and easiest person to get along with that I've ever known. But it's just that this is where my interest went, trying to understand those parts of our history, or joint history, because he and I and our family all lived through the dark hours of the Holocaust, trying to understand the human mind, the human spirit, and what makes human beings do things which go completely against what we think of as reason. Now, having been both very close and very far from my father, both in fields and in continents, I got a chance to ask him some questions that some people here have wondered about. And one of them is, why did he not pay attention to propaganda, to forms of speech which are absolutely not rational, to what we would call today, in our modern parlance, Karl Rove's playbook? Not that he didn't know about that. I mean, we had lived through Hitler and Goebbels, and we had heard the darkest speeches that could be the most unreasonable, irrational speeches. But his answer to me was, I am a philosopher. As a philosopher, I'm only working, it's not that the other things are not important, but I'm only working in the field of rational argument, the way one philosopher would talk to another philosopher in an effort to reach the truth, to understand what is the truth. What is the truth in a world which refuses a truth that is given? Now, Brussels University was founded in response to the reopening of the Catholic University of Louvain. And the motto of Brussels University is free inquiry, le libre examen. And what their song, which is quite irreverent, is à bas la calotte, down with the skull cap, which meant basically down with a religion which accepts given an absolute authority, which tells you what you have to believe. And in that case, it was the Catholic Church. Now, my father was not anti-Catholic, then he remembers that at our wedding, the first row was entirely cardinals and bishops. So those were his friends, but he shared in that idea that revealed truth is not acceptable to a free mind, that you have to have the right to inquire freely and search freely for the truth. David said that we live in a terrible time right now, where the rise of fundamentalisms of all kinds, and with grave dangers to rationalism. And you said very accurately that my father lived through similar or even worse dangers and worse irrationality. And I admire the optimism in the title of this conference, and I think that Perelman would have approved and would have felt very much that indeed this is where we need to go when the world seems like such a dangerous place. My father was born in Poland at a time of fierce anti-Semitism and turmoil. He was born in 1912, and his father had married a poor girl and had not gone to the university, had started looking for a way to make a living, and finding that it was not easy for a young man to make a living at that time in Poland, he decided to seek a better way to make a living and to come to Belgium, where there was a group of people in Antwerp, a group of Jewish people involved in the diamond trade who welcomed newcomers. So he left my father, then 12 years old, in charge of his mother and his 3 siblings, while he came to Belgium. Now, I spoke to one of my aunts is still alive, and I spoke to her, and she says, Chaim was very much in charge. He was in charge. He's the one who made sure that we survived, that we came to Belgium a year later. He arranged everything and so on. My father, one of the extraordinary things about him is always how young he was. The things he did as a 12-year-old, the things he did at those early ages, how competent he was. So my grandfather found a job in the diamond trade. Jews at that time always liked diamonds because you can put them in the lining of your coat in case you have to run away very fast. That's the best way to be able to carry things, valuables with you. He was not a diamond dealer. He was a poor guy. He was a broker. He would take a stone from one guy and sell it to somebody else. And my grandfather always eked out a living, and the apartment was a small apartment where they were all crowded on one on top of another. When my father wanted to study, he went to the corner cafe, which was the only place where he would have a little peace. My father came to Brussels. He's then 13 at that time. He speaks Yiddish and Polish, and very shortly learns French and Flemish, which is what he needs to learn in order to be a student in the high school in Belgium. He got pocket money, supported himself by teaching Latin to his classmates. He told me he was staying 1 week ahead in the book. He would read the book 1 week ahead and then teach his classmates and make some money tutoring. Despite all of that and all that turmoil, he manages to graduate early, and he goes to Brussels University to study philosophy of all things. He was immediately recognized as something really special, really great intellect. He meets my mother when he's 19. They were classmates. My mother was almost 3 years older than he was, but they were classmates because she had come from Poland, and the gymnasium in Poland lasted a year longer, and my father was ahead, so they were classmates even though almost 3 years in age difference. He never told her until he went to get papers to get married. He lied to her about his age, fearing that she would not allow him to, she would not be willing to be his girlfriend. They meet, and the first words were, he introduces himself to her, and she says, "You're Perelman? You don't look it." his reputation had preceded him, and she expected something very different. Anyway, he falls madly in love with her, and this was an extraordinary love affair, very vibrant, and I mean, they fought, they loved, they were very vibrant all their lives, and it was really a true partnership. And there's absolutely no way to overestimate how much my mother contributed to who my father was, what my father did, and certainly to everything other than his purely intellectual pursuits. They had an extraordinary life together. My father would not have had that life with somebody other than my mother. She was quite an amazing woman. She was the granddaughter of a grand rabbi of Belgian, and at that time a grand rabbi in Poland, in the Jewish community. The way I understand it, it's something like the Godfather without the crime. But you have an idea that people come all the time to ask for favors, to ask for help, and so there is a constant flow of people coming in and asking, please help, please do this, please advise, please do that. And that's a very interesting thing to know, because that was the way my parents' home became later on. It was exactly that way, and you may remember that, Danny. There was oodles of people there all the time. When I would get up in the morning, I had to be fully dressed to go to breakfast because there would be all these people everywhere. I still remember a time when a colleague and friend, Schleppner, came to the house, and he asked me, is your dad home? I said, no, he's at the university. Where's your mom? I say, she's taking a nap. He says, she's taking a nap with all these guests here? And I looked around, and indeed, there were 12 people there. And I said, those are not guests, they are just growing here. That was the way it was. There was a pianist, a young pianist who was rehearsing, practicing the piano in one corner. There was a painter who had an easel somewhere else. There were people who were waiting to talk to my mother because they needed help with this or they needed help with that, and one group was in one room, one group was in another room, and they were just there waiting for the time when they would have an audience, not with my father, with my mother. She was the grand rabbi. And so this was a rather extraordinary life. In addition, the phone rang constantly. And she would run and answer. It was usually for her. And she would answer in 4 languages or 5 languages, totally fluently, going from one to the other. This house was alive. It truly was alive. Not like anything that I think that any of you has ever experienced. Not always easy for me, because once in a while she would also give away my room. I would come home and she would announce to me that I better find a place to be because my room has been given to some guest coming from here or there. So my father meets my mother, a great love affair. He finishes Brussels University, and so does she. She had a PhD in history. She wrote a couple of books. And I was born, they were married in 1935. I was born the next year. And then come the dark years are starting. The terrible things happening in Poland where my mother's family still is. And all this darkness gathering all around. My father was in the military at the time, and as the war starts, he is involved in battle, but when he hears that the Belgian army is about to surrender, he goes AWOL in order not to be captured, and he comes back to Brussels. At that time, my mother with my grandparents and aunts, my father's family, we go on the exodus, trying to escape to France, but under the bombs. but it doesn't work out, and after different events, we come back to Belgium. During the war, after a short while, I was no longer with my parents because they started doing very dangerous work in the underground, and I was a foster child, a hidden child in foster homes. My father, at the time when the war starts, is 28 years old. A year or so later, the Nazis asked the Grand Rabbi of Belgium to get together a group of the leaders of the Jewish community in Belgium in order to organize the Jewish community. And that was something, Association des Juifs de Belgique, AGB. I say how young my father was, that he would be one of the leaders of the Jewish community who is being asked to join this group. After a while, he and another person in that committee realized that the AGB is actually going to be used by the Nazis not to help the Jews, but to facilitate their work of they didn't know really about extermination, but deportation and so on. So my father and this other guy with two other people create a different committee, a clandestine committee called the Comité de Défense des Juifs, and decide that they are going to stay as part of the AGB because to resign officially would be to tip off the Nazis that they know what's going on. And in fact, they managed to subvert some of the resources of the AGB in order to be helpful to the CDG. I must say that all the pictures of the partisans of that time show a dozen men and my mother. My mother was always absolutely there. She was the equal partner. She was involved in every bit of any of that. Never took much of the credit because she was of another age where the credit always goes to her husband. Mm-hmm. But she was absolutely central in all of these endeavors. And she was also probably the smartest person I've ever met. My father may have been the most intelligent, but my mother had a savvy and a smarts, the likes of which I've never seen. So the group did partisan work, resistance, underground work. And recently, a few years ago, I had a rather extraordinary experience. A friend of mine who lives in Park City, I live in Salt Lake City, Utah, and that friend lives in Park City, and she's at lunch with a friend of hers and a visitor from LA. The visitor from LA says, my sister has just written a book about my father's life called Escape to Life, and explaining how my father escaped from Buchenwald, where that's not my father, that's her father, escaped from Buchenwald, where his wife and two babies were exterminated. And he comes back to Belgium, and he tries to tell his story, tell people what is going on in Buchenwald, in concentration camps. And nobody would believe him. And my friend at that time says, if your father was from Belgium, would he know the parents of my friend Noemi? And this woman says, the book is dedicated to Professor Perelman. Because when nobody would believe him, somebody sent him to my father who did believe him, and who got together a group of people and Herskovits says he thought my mother was playing the piano. That's not true. It was, I know who it was. It was somebody else. They were playing the piano in order to ensure that if there were bugs, nobody could hear their conversation. And so this escapee, Herskovits, told his story to the assembled group. And after that, the most heroic deed of the Belgian underground happened, which was blowing up the rails of a train, because for the first time they knew that the people were not being sent to a labor camp, they were being sent to concentration camps. And that has always been something very special to me, because, you know, in my work, I feel it's so important that I believe whatever my patients tell me, and sometimes it's the unbelievable. And I felt such a kinship to my father, was willing to believe the unbelievable. So my father knew something about the ugliness of which human beings are capable. And if he didn't write about it, it's not because he didn't think it was important. So there were some interesting tidbits in this underground work that I've been talking about with David. This underground was a strange marriage, because there were some people who were communist or communist sympathizers. Everybody was united in fighting the Nazis, but the communist sympathizers were hoping to defeat fascism to establish a communist system in Western Europe. And on the other hand, there were people like my parents who were Zionists, and they wanted very much to have the Jewish people survive, not only to ensure the survival of human beings, but also ensure the survival of a people, because the Nazis has been so intent on destroying the Jewish people. Actually, the Holocaust is the only war which was primarily directed against children, because the Nazis wanted to destroy the Jewish seed. They wanted the Jews to be erased from the face of the earth. So the Zionists felt it was so important to allow the Jewish people to survive as a people. Now, my parents were not religious. Neither of them ever set foot in the synagogue or worshipped in any way. My father was trained in Talmudic studies as a youngster and understood that very well, but neither of them was religious. And in Europe, most people are not religious in Western Europe. It's an American peculiarity that people either are religious or pretend to be in very large numbers. But the Jewish people as a people needed to survive. That conflict between the communists and the Zionists is one that has been perpetuated through the years, and actually it's still going on, because there's a historian who is a communist who hated my mother, and my mother hated him, who is trying very hard to change history, to hijack history, and to give all the credit to the communists, and to erase or minimize the role of the Zionists. And this is a different story altogether, but it's interesting that this feud is going on after the death of many of the participants. After the war, my father went back to his studies. My mother became very involved with the Mossad. And what she was doing, she was coordinating the illegal immigration of people coming back from camps and who wanted to go to Israel. And if anybody wants to hear funny stories at some time at lunch or whatever, I'll be glad to tell you stories from my mother, which will keep you in stitches, because she was superbly funny in addition to everything else. So I get a good laugh when I tell her stories. The home was a strange place at that time because we saw so many people coming back from camps, and they were refugee camps. People from the concentration camps were brought to refugee camps, and my mother would take the children home. And so I came home after having been in hiding, and all of a sudden I and my parents home, and there are 40 other children. You know, I had to take my turn. And this was a house that was a common house. It was everybody's house. My father goes back to his studies. He refuses every kind of medals. In Belgium, you have to sign to get a medal. And he sends back a letter saying, I only did what I had to. My house was on fire. I took a pail of water to extinguish the fire. I don't need medals, and I will not accept medals except for academic achievements. My mother didn't mind the medals. She loved it with a little feather hat. And he goes back to his work. Actually, he had never really interrupted his work, because while in the underground, in the darkest hours, he's writing his book on justice. And my mother has always said that she is responsible for one line in that book. The one line is, Perelman writes, the Nazis are saying that. And my mother said, you should say the Nazis were saying, because this book will not be published as long as the Nazis are saying. So the Nazis are vanquished, and the book gets published. And my father is promoted to full professor, the youngest in the history of Brussels University. During the war, by the way, he could not teach. The children could not go to school. The professors could not teach. If you were Jewish, you were crossed out of society. But the University of Brussels continued to pay his salary and kept him alive through the war years, which is one reason why my father would never leave Brussels later, because he felt a deep debt of gratitude towards the university. I think back again how young he was. I remember when I was 10 years old, he came with me to register me to secondary school. We have, sixth grade and then 7 to 12 in Belgium. There's no middle school. So he comes with me to register me. I'm 10, he's 24. 34, excuse me. He's 34, a dashing young man. And we go to the place where some young teachers are on duty to register the new students. And as we walk in the door, all of them rise. It was such a shock for me. There I was, my young father, and everybody rises when he walks into the door. 34 years old. He goes back to his studies, his work. My mother continues her work for the State of Israel. And this is the time, around then, a few years later, when he starts the book, the new Rhetoric. Now, this is where Lucie Olbrechts comes into the picture as well. Lucie Olbrechts was, I guess, the very opposite of my mother. My mother was flamboyant, she was funny, she was savvy, she was smart, she was adored or hated, but nobody had nothing but extreme feelings about her. Stella, you knew her well, and people who have known her seem to have a devotion to her that goes on years and years after her death. I went to a ceremony after 9/11 that was 10 years after my mother had died, and there were over 200 people who came to a memorial for my mother, including young people, the people who could not let go of what my mother had meant to them. Lucie Olbrechts was the very opposite. She was transparent. She had pale skin and wispy blonde hair. She has always been old. I've always known her to be old, all the times that I've known her. She was very close to me because I was the only child in her world. So she gave me the doll that had been hers when she was a child. She gave me things that were very precious to her. Lucie and her husband had been social friends with my parents, even though they were much older. And Lucie had actually worked with my mother in the underground, in the work around schools and helping children. And at some point, at some dinner party, my father was talking about his big project that what he wanted to do. And she got really excited. He was saying that he needed an assistant because he wanted to have examples and a whole lot of legwork to be done. Most of the work that he did usually came just from his head. He didn't need the legwork. But for this book, he wanted examples and searching the literature and whatever, and he was looking for an assistant. And she volunteered to do that. She was the daughter of a well-known psychiatrist who was dead by the time I met her. She was quite well off. Her husband was quite well off, not rich, but very comfortable. She had gone to the university, had finished her bachelor's degree, and licence, and had basically didn't do what most women in her station would be doing at the time. Most women at the time would be involved in good deeds, or they would be involved in an active social life, or they would have some hobbies. She really didn't have any of that. Her husband was very retiring. He spent his whole time that I knew him in his office. He was a statistician, with everything that implies in terms of fun and games. And, and she was basically very, very lonely with nothing much to do except read. She read a lot. And so she volunteered to work with my dad, and they worked together for a long time. My mother kind of objected to, because she wanted my father to spend more time with his students. She said, if you want to establish a school in Brussels, it's important that you spend more time with your students. But so they published this book, which was going to be 2,000 pages long. The publisher would not hear of it, so they cut it down to 800 pages. And there was all this extra material that never got published. What her role was, there's a story which I asked David if I should tell it or not, because I think about my parents' confidentiality, and then they also have to balance that against history. But I remember when the book was published, my father and my mother were discussing the authorship, and they had talked about saying Chaim Perelman with the collaboration of Lucie Olbrechts-Tyteca. And then my father said, no, she really should have her name as a co-author because she has worked for 10 years, she has never been paid, and this is the only payment that I could ever give her. And my mother says, but people will wonder about who did what. He says, don't be ridiculous. Everybody knows. Everybody knows who the philosopher is. And my name is first and in reverse alphabetical order and whatever. Everybody knows. And my mother says, well, maybe there might be a day when everybody won't know. That's a story that I witnessed. And my mother was always right. And so my father went on to write many books, many articles, and get honors galore. Doctors honoris causa here and there, the Franqui Prize, whatever you could earn. He was president of everything and anything, and he had different projects here and projects there. He had projects with lawyers and judges on the topic of how do lawyers or judges reason. He had groups of historians working together about what is a fact according to historians. How do historians decide what a historical fact is? And at that time, I was no longer, I left Belgium in 1958. He had, as I say, honors upon honors. At the end of his life, he was made a baron by the King of Belgium. He told his friend Manelli that he had considered not accepting that because he was profoundly democratic. It kind of bothered him to have a title of nobility. On the other hand, it kind of tickled him, you know, that there he is. He was a little Jewish kid from Poland who comes there and becomes ennobled in the Belgian kingdom. That's quite something. My mother's thrilled. Lapped it up. My father was thrilled that it was a hereditary title and he could pass it on to me, but I have made no use of it. I don't know what I would do with it, unless I wanted to sell cosmetics. My cynical son, when I called him and I say, your grandfather was just made a baron by the King of Belgium, says, is there any land that goes with it? Well, unfortunately, this was kind of the last honor to come my father's way because he died very shortly after that. He had to choose the vice. You say how do you call them? Motto? Motto. He had to choose a motto, and he chose Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdof. Justice, justice, you will pursue. Tzedek is an interesting word because it's both justice and equity. In Hebrew, there is one word for straight, narrow justice, the rule of law, and there is one word for justice, but justice embraces equity and charity, because if it's not charitable, it's not just. It has to be right. Giving charity is really giving people what they are due, what they are owed. So this is the motto on his coat of arms. The Belgian parliament had to pass a special law to allow Hebrew on the coat of arms in Belgium because they allowed French and Flemish and Latin. So Hebrew that's the one time. My mother was she had this pride of Jewishness. There are stories about her, for example, going back in time, but there's somebody one day, a landlady who wants to know if they are Jewish when they're still young and says, I notice you don't go to church on Sunday. My mother's response, no, we're Jewish, but we don't mind at all if you go to church. This was my mother's absolute pride of who she was. No shame, no hiding, never allowing anybody to condescend to her. My father, and this is something I should have added before, my father was known as Henry in Polish schools. He was always Chaim at home, in his parents' home. It was Henio in Polish schools, and in Belgium, Henry. And that was until World War II. And after World War II, he proudly took on the name Chaim, even though it's not usual in Belgium or in France to use a Hebrew name, he proudly went back to the name Chaim. So that was for pride of Jewishness. Now, my father died, as I said, he died in 1984. At that time, my daughter-in-law was pregnant with their first child, who was Aaron's older sister. And at the funeral, there were throngs for blocks and blocks and blocks. Now, I don't know if you know many college professors who have a funeral like a president or like a prime minister or whatever. He was a rock star. he had a funeral where people for hours and hours and hours were coming in to pay their respects. And the honors continued after he died. A street was named after him. My mother always had it after him, never them. It should have been them, but it's always him. I'm trying to rectify that. The house had a plaque as a high place of the Belgian resistance. And the honors were many and many. I don't think that he cared very much about any of them except as a hood, but it really didn't matter that much. What would have mattered to him is having all of you people. He was talking to posterity. He wanted his work to continue. He wanted all of you to dialogue with him as he had been dialoguing with Aristotle and Kant and others. And so your presence and the work that you're doing around his legacy is the greatest honor and the greatest gift that you could have given him, and I'm very grateful for that. Thank you. Should I ask for questions?
Sure.
Yeah. Maybe there are some questions. Thank you for this. I'm very touched. Maybe there are some questions, and I would be glad to answer any questions that I'm able to answer. Anybody? Okay, if you don't have questions now, I'll be around. And if there are questions that you want to ask me at some other time, I'll be very glad to talk with each and every one of you. Oh, yes. Here, what?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. One of your mother's stories.
Oh, one of my mother's stories. Okay. Okay. Here's a story that she tells after the war. After the war, she's organizing these groups of people going to Palestine illegally, because it was under the British mandate and Jews were not allowed to go there. You had at the time a lot of people coming from concentration camps, and you had to arrange to send them on these boats. Now, if you wait to get everybody's name and identity, that would take forever. Those people are in camps. You have to work now. My mother doesn't obey any rules. She does what needs to be done, and she does it now. So groups of people get together, and they invent list of names and ages and whatever. And, Goldberg and Rabinovich and, and so on, a series of Jewish names. And then they sign the papers for these people. And I was enlisted as an 8-year-old to help forge some signatures because they couldn't have only PhDs signing all these documents, so they needed somebody who was still a little illiterate, and so I became a forger at the age of 8. Then with those lists, my mother goes and talks with the Consul of Panama to get visas to ostensibly send those people to Panama, and he really wants those people to go there. And she tells the story about how she visits this guy in a hotel room in Antwerp, but he has the flu, so he can't come out of the hotel room, and she visits him in his bathrobe in the hotel room, and she's with some assistant, and he has somebody there. At some point, they want to talk privately. So they decide the only place they can be private is in the bathroom. And there my mother is sitting on the toilet, and he's sitting on the bidet. And they are negotiating the fate of these hundreds of people. And my mother gets those visas for Panama. And on the basis of the visas for Panama, she gets transit visas for these people through Belgium. And as the people come, a picture is taken, and they are each given their identity, whatever identity they got for the day. And then comes the moment when they're all brought to the ships. And they are the Belgian officials who are checking them off, Goldberg and Rabinovich. Suddenly a mistake is discovered. One page has been erroneously copied twice, and two groups of people have the same identity. There's already been a Mr. Rabinovich, and suddenly there's a second Mr. Rabinovich. That's possible, but the second Mrs. Goldberg and the second Mr. Schwartz, and so on. So obviously something's wrong. The officials don't know what to do. My mother, knowing the mind of bureaucrats, says, you know what? Why don't we all go, or in the meantime, I forgot to say, she has arrived there and has put herself in the middle of all the officials saying, I represent the International Association of Refugees. She puts herself there. She's now part of the officials. So she tells the people when they discover this problem, why don't we all go to the corner cafe, have a cup of coffee, discuss what we should do, and then we'll come back, we'll have a decision. And as they all leave, she tells her Mossad associate in Hebrew, get them all on board. They're all gone. They come back a half an hour later. All the refugees are on the ship, and the ship is sailing. And people say, the official says, my God, what's going on? My mother said, let's not worry about it. You know, this is Panama's problem. They're going to Panama. Panamanians will figure it out. And bureaucrats don't want to bother. They're fine, they go home. Everybody is ready to go home. And at that moment, as the ship is about 200 feet away, those refugees filled with joy, start singing Hatikva, which is the Hebrew national anthem, the Jewish national anthem, which is called the Hope. They start singing Hatikva in the loudest voice ever, and from the shore, everybody can hear those people singing Hatikva. And all the bureaucrats look at Mother and say, what's that? My mother says, that's the Panamanian national anthem. They have been studying it for weeks. Any more serious question? Yes.
Famous story of Perelman, who was offered the scholarship to come to America to when he was younger, was he concerned with eloquence? Was he a good speaker? Did he talk about politicians or public figures who were especially...
He was a philosopher. He was a good speaker. He had a lot of energy. He always had something to say. He would lecture to anybody he met. That included the Cardinal of Venice, then to become Pope John the 22nd, whom he met at the philosophy meeting, or the Queen of Greece, or whoever. Every time you see him, he's lecturing anybody that he meets. He didn't know about the field of speech, never heard of it. He didn't know very much about America because, you know, Western Europeans at the time didn't have the highest respect for America and the humanities. They thought that, you know, there's science happening here. But he didn't very much pay attention to American scholarship at the time. I think that I'm responsible for establishing a link to America because once he had a daughter on this continent, he had to figure out a way to come and visit me. So,
Did either of your parents know Martin Buber or
Oh, yes.
Karl Popper? Can you talk about that?
I didn't know them, so I can't tell you. I can tell you that my parents' golden book, where all the people who visited their home signed, is filled with the great and famous. Golda Meir was a close friend of my mother's. My mother says she's the first person who ever called Ben Gurion Mr. President. And Teddy Kollek would, I remember going to Israel, and he was not in Jerusalem when we were there, and we went to Eilat, and Teddy Kollek took a car and came to Eilat to see my mother because he couldn't have her be there and not visit with her. She was really beloved by lots of people. She had done very important work, both in the underground and with the Mossad to establish the State of Israel. Anybody else? Thank you.
Very good. You were totally welcome.
Jim and David and I will remain around here. If any of you don't know your way home, we can help direct you. Thank you so much, Noemi.